Hello, my name is Ciara and welcome to the Cliffs of Moher visitor experience. As part of National Heritage Week 2020, I will regale you of the folklore and legends of the Cliffs of Moher. You will learn of ancient Ireland, of magical creatures, a Celtic warrior, a defiant woman, a lost city, a furious storm, and of the many layers of magic that surround us here at the Cliffs of Moher. For hundreds of years, these stories have been passed down through word of mouth in the area, and many of them have been recorded in the school's collection of the 1930s. Humans, people, we are wired for stories. Many of us hold fond memories of our parents and grandparents telling us folklore stories, and we love to pass them on to the next generation, to our own children. So today, I will be carrying on the tradition of storytelling for you all. I will begin with the story of how Hags Head got its name. I will begin with the story of how Hags Head got its name. Now, down to the end of the cliff, down to the most southerly point, is an area known as Hags Head. Locals know it as Hags Head. And by a hag, I mean a witch. And the story goes that an old hag called Mal fell in love with an Irish warrior called Cuchulainn. Now, Cuchulainn didn't return his feelings to Mal. He found her advances very distasteful. And this made Mal outrageously crazy, so she decided to chase Cuchulainn. And the chase went wildly all along the Clare coastline, over mountains, through the burn, until they reached Loop Head. And at Loop Head, Mal was convinced she had Cuchulainn cornered there. But Cuchulainn, being a remarkably strong warrior, managed to leap from sea stack to sea stack all the way back to the Cliffs of Moher. And Mal tried to follow him once again, but her not being as nimble on her footing, slipped on a sea stack and dashed against the side of the cliffs to a gruesome death. And they say her blood flowed throughout the Atlantic Ocean, and the cliffs took on the formation of her face. Now, apparently her blood flowed as far as Milltown Malbay, and so Milltown Malbay took its name after poor Mal. You're aware that when St. Patrick came to Ireland, he banished the snakes. However, as in many cultures, the snakes in this story are a reference to our pagan ancestors. At the time in Ireland, the spiritual leaders, Celtic gods or fairies, were a tribe known as the Tuatha, the people of the divine goddess Danann. Now, this tribe were infuriated at the bringing of Christianity to Ireland by St. Patrick. So they decided to retreat into the underworld, into the caves and into the land of County Clare. And after many hundreds of years of living in the underworld, it came their time to be called out. In the form of beautiful white foals, 7 Tuatha gods galloped out into the light of day, which they had not seen for many years. Spooked and blinded by the light, they did not realize they were heading for the Cliffs of Moher. They galloped and galloped and leaped over the cliffs and passed into the afterlife. And beneath the area from where they leaped now break some of the most magnificent waves in the world, known as Ailleens. And some people think that when they're watching the waves break, they can see horses riding through them. you'll notice that the Atlantic Ocean is mentioned in much of our stories here in the local area. Now, many people believe that magical creatures haunt the Atlantic Ocean. And there was a storyteller here in the 50s, 60s and 70s. He was known as Dinny Mcmahon. He'd be also up on the cliffs selling trinkets such as shillelaghs and tin whistles and postcards. But this guy now had a knack for the old folklore and mythology, and visitors would come up to him and he'd be watching them, looking out to sea, and he'd warn them, "Don't you be looking down at those fearsome mermaids that haunt the caves of the Cliffs of Moher. If ye catch a glimpse of those mermaids, you're doomed to leave this world very soon after seeing them." Now, fearsome mermaids. I've never heard of such type of mermaids. I'm not really sure what to think of that. But I guess I'll leave that up to your imaginations. Hold on to your cap, we say here at the Cliffs of Moher when there's strong winds here, because we are no strangers to strong winds and storms. But there is one storm that stays in the mind of our people. It has stayed in our minds for 181 years, in fact. And this was a devastating storm that hit here on the 6th of January in 1839. This was known as the Night of the Big Wind, or Ihana Guihamora. Now, on this particular day, on the 6th of January, most Irish people would have been preparing for Little Christmas and the Feast of the Epiphany. And the day before, on the 5th, was the first snowfall of that year. The next morning, however, it was extremely warm. The snow had melted. People say that the air was so still along the west coast that voices could be heard floating on the air between houses more than a mile apart. Now, by 3 p.m. that day, the rain started and the wind stirred. But by 6 p.m, be God, the wind was roaring and the rain was pounding with bursts of hail. People say that church bells chimed and dogs whined. Haystacks and thatch roofs took a pounding. Doors banged and fires flickered. The terror was taken over the people. Apparently, fishermen turned their ears to the west and they could hear a distant, increasingly loud rumble on the frothy horizon. By 10 p.m, Ireland was in the throes of a furious storm that would continue unabated until 6 a.m. the next morning. Now, throughout the night, people were terrified. They had to leave their houses because their houses were falling on top of them. You have to remember, at this time in Ireland, people lived in the little old jerry houses and little thatched cottages, so they weren't going to withstand a strong storm like this. There's records of people going down on all fours, their hands and knees, calling for help, help, help. Now, if they wanted to speak to each other, there was no speaking to each other over the roar of such a wind like that. They had to hold onto each other, grab onto each other, and roar into each other's ears in order to hear. People put babies and children into chests, into baskets, and into pots with rocks on top for fear that the children would be blown away. But here in this area on the west coast, it was said that the storm hit the Cliffs of Moher with such strength that the waves broke over the top of the cliffs. In all fairness, we're lucky here on the west coast to have such magnificent cliffs forming a barrier. For if the Cliffs of Moher wasn't here, people believe that the water would have engulfed the entire country. People also say that huge boulders were tossed from the ocean onto the cliff tops of the Aran Islands. So it was an eventful night. People were terrified. The next morning, people had lost their property. The place was destroyed. Animals and livestock were killed. Churches had fallen down. People had died from falling masonry. Now, apparently, between 500 and 800 people died that night. Some will estimate it at 300, but you can add more onto it from the people who died from falling objects and injuries. Now, they were shocked. They did not see this event coming. You see, back then, they didn't have the weather forecasting techniques as we do today. Some people had barometers and they would have noticed a drop in pressure. But for the ordinary person, they didn't know this storm was coming. They might have noticed animals acting strangely, like the dogs whining, but it was unexpected. And so, back then, we had some superstitious people, and many thought that the wind was caused by the fairies. You see, on the 6th of January, it wasn't only Little Christmas or the Feast of the Epiphany. That 6th of January was also known as a night of revelry for the fairies, and people believed those elf fairies were being too unruly that night, and that was a result in the storm. Others believe that the Irish fairies left Ireland that night, and of course, the result of their departure was this mighty big wind. For the most devout people in Ireland, with a lot of Roman Catholics, and many of them believed this was a divine event. And on the 7th of January, the day of judgment would come upon them. So you can imagine the intense fear of the people here. Not only had they lost loved ones and their property was destroyed, they thought the 7th of January would be the day of judgment. So I suppose the day of judgment never came, but the fear of that night stayed in the minds of our people. And so that story has been kept in our minds until this very day. You'll also find some recordings of it in the school's collection of the 1930s. It's worth a read on dukish.ie. So thankfully, the Cliffs of Moher stayed standing, and I suppose O'Brien's Tower, built in 1835, stayed standing too. So we're here, safe and sound. Lovely memories of that storm. Sounded like a scary time, and I hope I'll never witness it in my life. I will now tell you the story of the lost city of Kilstiffen. Now, some say if you look south towards Spanish Point, you'll see an area of disturbed water. And this marks the location of an ancient city called Kilstiffen. Now, the chieftain of Kilstiffen took part in a ferocious battle and lost a special golden key that opened the gates to the city. Now, without this golden key, which was steeped in magic, the city will not be restored. It has sank far beneath the ocean, and some believe that the golden key is buried far beneath an Ogham-inscribed gravestone on the top of Slieve Callan. By Ogham, I mean an old Celtic language. Others believe it was thrown into a lake on the top of the same mountain, but no one really knows. What we do know is sometimes there's a shimmer on the ocean, a magical shimmer, and that is apparently the golden towers, the castles and steeples of Kilstiffen shining up from far beneath the ocean. It is said that the city will rise above the waves once in every 7 years, but if you were to catch a glimpse of that city, you will not be alive to see it again the next time. Now, Westrop, a famous historian and folklorist, mentioned that Liscannor Bay, far beneath the ocean, are submerged forests and bogland. He also mentioned a tidal wave that took place here between 799 and 802 AD, and that this all formed the basis for the story of the lost city of Kilstiffen. Now, there are many defiant women in Irish folklore, and this next legend I'm about to tell you is of a woman called Maire Rua. Now, Maire Rua, meaning Red Mary, was known for her beautiful red hair and her fiery personality. She lived in a place called Leyendecker Castle in Kilnaboy in the Burren region, not too far from the Cliffs of Moher. And in the early 1600s, she married a man called Conor O'Brien. O'Brien was badly wounded in a siege, and when his mortally wounded body was brought back as far as Leyendecker Castle, it is said that she shouted from her window, "What use have I for dead men?" So she put on her best finery and galloped to Limerick on her stallion in search of another husband. So she found a man called John Cooper, a Cromwellian soldier and enemy of her last husband. And she married him, and this marriage secured the property rights for her children. Now, John didn't last too long with Maire. He had quite an early death, and people don't really know what happened to him, but speculation says that one morning he was shaven with a sharp razor blade with a basin just beside Maire Rua's bed, and they were having an old morning chat. But didn't John Cooper happen to speak badly about Conor O'Brien, her last husband? Maire didn't like this. Up she hopped and gave him a right kick, and didn't the blade go right into John Cooper, and that was the end of him. Others say that poor old John suffocated. He smothered under the luxurious pillows of Leyendecker Castle. We just don't know. Now, Maire Rua is said to have up to 25 husbands. Now, she was a very wealthy woman. She was powerful, a right defiant woman. She owned many horses, and horse riding enhanced her sense of power and control. She married a man called Brian. Now, Brian was in love with Maire. He admired her beauty when galloping upon beautiful horses. But Maire didn't return any feelings to Brian, until one day she suggested that they go for a romantic horse ride along the edge of the Cliffs of Moher. So off they went. They were galloping along the edge of the cliff, taking in the beautiful views. Then suddenly, Brian heard a whistle, and off his horse went galloping, galloping. It halted at the edge of the cliffs, and off poor Brian went to a gruesome death. So Maire had no other choice but to get another husband to secure the property rights. So this time she married a man called James. Now, James was excellent at horse riding and wanted to impress Maire, but no one could be better than Maire Rua at horse riding. So they challenged each other to a race as far as the Cliffs of Moher and back to Leyendecker Castle. So off they went, galloping, galloping. They were neck and neck, coming near the turning point of the cliffs. Then suddenly James heard a whistle, and off his horse went even faster. It didn't turn. It kept going faster and faster and faster, halted at the edge of the cliffs, and off poor James went to another gruesome death. Now at this stage, the horse's heart was pounding, 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 and didn't it collapse up in the cliffs there and then. And that area of the cliffs is known as Aill, the Cliff of the Broken Heart. Now sure, poor Maire Rua, she she was furious that her stallion died up there, because she loved her property. She loved everything she owned. But after many years down in Leyendecker Castle, she decided she wanted to up and move as far as the Dromoland area, because it was closer to civilization. It was closer to the likes of Ennis and Limerick. So she went down with a surveyor to see the land, a foreman, we would call him, and they noticed that there was a little widow's cabin down there. A widow was living there in a little hut. And she knocked on the widow's door, and she told that widow, "You better be out of here by the next morning, or I'll make you get out of here." And of course, she returned the next morning, knocked on the door, and the widow was still there. And she gave her a right whip because she didn't leave. And the poor widow went down on her hands and knees and looked up at Maire, and didn't she give her a widow's curse? She said, "That hateful Maire Rua may die with neck stretched between earth and sky." Ho ho ho, a widow's curse. Now, Maire didn't think much of this. She was like, "Will you stop with your old gibberish?" And she gave her another whip, and we don't actually know what happened to the widow, but she sent her off anyway. The widow never returned, but what she did do is leave that wretched widow's curse on Maire Rua. So she built her property down in Dromoland, and one morning she went off hunting with the lads, the young men. Now, it's funny because Maire Rua was aging, but she was still fit and able to keep up with all the young men. And she took after a red fox. You know, she liked the old red foxes to match her red hair. She was wearing a luxurious scarf at the time. And then the wind increased. It blew her lovely scarf up into the air. Her horse, her stallion, got frightened, and it reared up, and her scarf blew up into a tree, and it got stuck in the forked branch of an old oak tree in Carnally. Carnally is a place near Clare Castle. And wasn't Maire hanging up there? All the other huntsmen gathered around. Poor Maire was hanging from the tree, her neck broken. She was dead as a rat. Now, that was unfortunately the end of Maire Rua. She passed away there in Carnally, and no one will go near that old stump of a tree that's there now, stump of an old oak tree, because they say that Maire Rua's ghost is contained within that tree. Now, we see Maire Rua as quite a cruel woman, but if you look at it in this way, isn't it important to have defiant women in our Irish folklore? For women to stand out like that and to be noticed in the stories of our ancient past. So I hope you enjoyed that now. Thank you very much. In light of all this folklore, it is nice to reflect. What are we but the sum of our memories, the stories we live and the tales we tell ourselves? So here at the Cliffs of Moher, for Heritage Week, I have just regaled you with some of the folklore stories we have to offer here. And I invite you to come along, to come here again, and to create your own lovely folklore stories, to experience the magic that surrounds us, the world that coincides with us here at the Cliffs, the world of folklore.